Mason had suspected for a while that Zoe was cheating on him. It wasn't one big thing, but a series of small shifts, like tectonic plates grinding against each other. The late nights at the office became a constant. Another deadline, she'd say, her eyes never quite meeting his. Then there were the sudden interests. A pottery class she never went to. A book club where she always seemed to be the last one to know the meeting times. And her phone? That was the biggest red flag. She treated it like a live grenade, never letting it out of her sight. It was always face down, always silenced, always just out of reach. The tension was thick, a constant hum in the house, and it was making him feel sick. One Tuesday, the tension finally snapped. He was in the kitchen prepping a late dinner. Zoe had just stepped into the shower, the water drumming a relentless beat against the tile. Her phone buzzed, a quick, insistent vibration that echoed in the sudden quiet. It was lying face down on the counter as usual. Mason tried to ignore it, tried to focus on chopping vegetables, but the vibration seemed to burn into his brain. It was a message he could tell by the way the screen flashed. He glanced at it, just a quick peek, but the few words he saw were enough to gut him. "Can't wait to see you tonight," it read, the sender's name, Samuel, clearly visible. His stomach plummeted. The knife slipped in his hand and he barely registered a small cut on his finger. He didn't need to read another message or dig through Zoe's history to know what was going on. It all clicked into place, the late nights, the phone, her distant stares. He felt a mix of rage and nausea boil in his gut. The shock quickly followed. It wasn't that he hadn't suspected it, he had, but confirmation was a punch to the chest. Zoe emerged from the bathroom, a towel wrapped around her, water droplets clinging to her hair. She looked almost carefree, like she had nothing to hide. Mason held up her phone, his hand trembling slightly. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. She glanced at the screen, then at him. A smirk played on her lips. "Oh, you finally figured it out?" she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I was testing how oblivious you could be." She didn't deny it, not even a little. She just stood there, a smug expression plastered across her face. Then she dropped the bomb, as if this were just another casual conversation. "So what now? Divorce. If you want a divorce, I'll tell Samuel to divorce his wife too." Mason felt like he'd been punched, his breath stolen from his lungs. The floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. But then a strange calm washed over him. The shock was fading, replaced by a cold, hard anger. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by clarity. He didn't shout, didn't cry, just looked at her. He had never seen her so callous, so cruel. A strange resolve settled in his chest. He wouldn't let them get away with this. Not her and not Samuel. Before any divorce was finalized, before they moved on with their shiny new lives, he would make them both pay. He would make them both regret the day they decided to betray him. He wouldn't let them destroy his life without a fight. He would find a way to make them hurt like he was hurting now. He just didn't know how just yet. But he knew deep down that he wouldn't let this go. Zoe wasted no time. The next morning, while Mason was still reeling from the previous night's revelation, she was on the phone, her voice light and carefree as she spoke to Samuel. Mason overheard snippets of the conversation. "Finally. Can't wait. Everything will be different now." It was like a knife twisting in his gut with every word. He watched her pack a bag, her movements efficient and devoid of any remorse. Within a few hours, she was gone, leaving a gaping hole in their apartment and in his life. She didn't even bother with the pretense of a slow burn. It was full steam ahead. She and Samuel had the gall to make plans right under his nose. He knew she would tell Samuel what had happened, but he was surprised by how fast Samuel had agreed to start a new life. It was pathetic. He heard she and Samuel were both getting a divorce, and it seemed they were both rushing to be together. Samuel and Zoe began hunting for a new apartment together, looking in a different neighborhood across the city. They were eager to start their life together, carefully selecting a place that would symbolize their fresh start. Meanwhile, Mason had already begun the process of selling their shared apartment, ensuring a clean break from his past life with Zoe. Within a week, Samuel and Zoe found a new apartment in a different part of the city, moving in together with an air of excitement and defiance. They acted like the world was their playground, oblivious to the wreckage they had left behind. Mason watched their movements from a distance, his anger a cold fire now, not a roaring blaze. He felt nothing, not yet anyway. He was going to be patient and let them think they'd won. Mason needed a partner in this, someone who understood the depth of the betrayal, someone who felt the same burn of injustice. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He had to find Hannah, Samuel's wife. It had been a difficult decision to get her involved, but he felt it was right. He tracked her down, found her office number. He called and kept the conversation brief, not explaining, just asking to meet. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, a place where they could talk without the prying eyes of their shared acquaintances. When Hannah walked in, Mason could see the strain etched on her face, dark circles under her eyes, her shoulders hunched like she was carrying the weight of the world. She hadn't slept well in days, maybe weeks. He could see the flicker of hope in her eyes, though, the desperation to make sense of things. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore a shapeless dress. She looked small and fragile, but something in her eyes told him there was more. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He got right to the point, laying out the details of Zoe and Samuel's affair, the messages, the phone, their plans to divorce their spouses and begin a new life together. He watched her face as the words spilled out, a slow progression from confusion to disbelief to a hollow, heartbreaking pain. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with shock. She picked up her coffee mug, her hands trembling so much that she almost dropped it. "I had no idea," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She stared down into the dark liquid as if she expected answers there. I thought we were happy." Mason felt a pang of guilt, a sharp jab in his chest. He was the one who had shattered her world, the one who had confirmed her worst fears. But he pushed it aside, buried it deep down. This wasn't about sympathy, not anymore. This was about justice, about making them pay. He needed her, even if it meant hurting her more in the short term. "They didn't care about us," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "They're not going to get away with this." He needed her strength, her pain, to turn this into something. He watched her, her quiet sorrow, and he could see a flicker of something else as she looked back up at him. It wasn't rage, but it was close. It was the spark of a woman who was about to take back control of her life. A few weeks later, Samuel was feeling on top of the world. He had Zoe, a new life, and he was going to show her just how good his life could be. He took her to a fancy restaurant, one of those places where the waiters spoke in hushed tones and the prices were sky high. He slid into his chair with a smug grin, feeling like a king. He ordered a bottle of expensive wine, the kind he used to reserve for special occasions with Hannah. Now, every night was a special occasion. He flashed his credit card with a flourish, the gesture a show of his newfound freedom. But then the waiter returned, his face apologetic. "I am sorry, sir, but your card was declined." Samuel scoffed, waved it away. "Must be a mistake." he said. He pulled out another card, his smile faltering just a bit. Declined. Another card. Same result. A cold dread began to creep into his chest. He felt the eyes of the other diners, and his skin began to crawl. His confidence, so carefully constructed, was beginning to crack. Zoe's eyebrow arched, her patience already wearing thin. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp with an edge of irritation. Gone was the adoring look she had worn earlier in the evening. Now she looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and growing annoyance. "Nothing," Samuel muttered, but his voice betrayed his panic. He tried to maintain his composure, but sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he navigated to his bank accounts. Each swipe revealed another nightmare. Accounts frozen, balances zeroed out, investments vanished. "This can't be happening," he whispered, more to himself than to Zoe. He looked up, catching her skeptical gaze. "I need to figure this out," he said, his voice rising slightly. The elegant restaurant, with its hushed conversations and soft lighting, suddenly felt suffocating. "Are you serious?" Zoe hissed. "We're in the middle of dinner, and you are having some kind of financial meltdown?" Her voice was low but intense, drawing curious glances from nearby tables. Samuel could see the judgment in her eyes, the same look she had given him when things first started to go wrong. He stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape that caused several heads to turn. "I need to go," he said, his voice a desperate whisper. Zoe stared at him, her face a mixture of confusion and mounting frustration. "Go? We just got here," she protested. But Samuel was already moving. He pulled out some cash, throwing it on the table, far less than the bill would require. His mind was racing, panic setting in like a cold, suffocating fog. Outside the restaurant, the night air did little to calm him. He fumbled with his phone, calling his bank, his financial advisor, anyone who might have an explanation. Each call ended the same way. Confused representatives, frozen accounts, no clear answers. Finally, desperate and trembling, he called Zoe's lawyer, the one who had been handling her divorce. "What's happening with my accounts?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "They're all frozen." "I have no idea, Mr. Miller," the lawyer said, his voice calm, too calm. "I can't reach Zoe either. She's disappeared." "Disappeared?" Samuel repeated the word as if he could not comprehend it. His world was spinning, everything he thought he knew crumbling around him. The perfect life he had been building with Zoe, with his new career, with his carefully constructed image, was dissolving before his eyes. He stood on the street, phone still pressed to his ear, feeling like he was drowning in a sea of uncertainty. Something was very, very wrong, and he was just beginning to realize the full extent of his situation. The story flashes back to the day Mason met Hannah at the cafe. After their conversation, the initial shock that had frozen her in place began to thaw, replaced by a different kind of coldness. It was a glacial rage, slow-moving but incredibly powerful. She went home, her mind a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts and emotions. She didn't allow herself to cry. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. She was past the point of weeping. She needed to dissect this, to understand, and then to act. She was done with feeling helpless. She began to methodically sift through Samuel's digital life, a digital archaeology of his betrayal. She went through his emails, bank statements, and phone records with a meticulousness that surprised even herself. It was a grim, sickening task, like picking through the remains of a disaster. She found the messages to Zoe, each one a cruel, graphic stab to her heart. They were filled with lies, promises, and declarations of a love that was nothing more than a grotesque parody. She saw the hidden accounts, the clandestine transfers, the complex network of shell corporations he had used to bleed money from his company. The full scope of Samuel's treachery unfolded before her, a panoramic display of deceit. He wasn't just unfaithful, he was a criminal, a fraud, a master of manipulation. She realized that their life, their marriage, it was all a lie, built on a foundation of sand. He had stolen her trust, her heart, and now she would take back what was hers. The pain hardened into something sharp and resolute. This wasn't going to be some messy confrontation, a shouting match followed by tears. No, this would be a calculated demolition, a dismantling of his life, piece by piece. She was done with being the victim, done with feeling hurt. She was the architect now, the engineer of Samuel's downfall, and she would not be swayed. She began to formulate a plan, each step deliberate, every detail considered with ruthless efficiency. She was done being the fool. Now it was Samuel's turn. The next day, Hannah approached Samuel with a stack of papers, her face a mask of cool indifference. She had spent hours perfecting her performance, the calm, detached wife going through the motions of a divorce. She donned a crisp blouse and a pencil skirt, the uniform of a woman who had everything under control. "These are the documents we need for the divorce," she said, her voice even, without a trace of the fury boiling beneath the surface. She held them out to him, her eyes fixed on his with a gaze that gave nothing away. She'd rehearsed this scene so many times in her head, she was like an actress performing for an empty room. Samuel, predictably, barely glanced at the papers. He was in his own world, a fantasy land of Zoe and a new life where he was the star. He was too busy thinking about their new apartment, the life they were going to create, the dinners they were going to have. His mind was already halfway out the door, ready to start his new life. He grabbed the pen, not even looking at the documents, and signed where she pointed, completely oblivious to the steely resolve in her eyes. "Just sign here," she said, pointing to various lines and boxes, her instructions delivered in a flat, emotionless tone. Samuel signed without a second thought, his attention already drifting away to his next adventure. He had no idea, none at all. With Samuel's signature in hand, Hannah moved with a speed and precision that would have made a military commander proud. She was like a well-oiled machine, every move deliberate, every action calculated. She sold their house, the place where she had built her life, piece by piece, all those memories just a thing of the past now. She liquidated their stocks, emptied their bank accounts, leaving nothing behind, not even a stray penny. She worked tirelessly through the night, fueled by her burning need for revenge, her focus laser sharp. She didn't sleep, didn't eat, her only goal to erase Samuel's financial footprint. She was taking everything, systematically dismantling every aspect of his carefully constructed world. She was the master of her own fate now. Then, when everything was done, when every last detail was complete, she disappeared. She shed her old identity like a snake shedding its skin, adopting a new name, a new persona, a completely fresh start. She fled the country, a ghost in the wind, leaving behind the broken, betrayed wife and becoming something else entirely. By the time Samuel realized the full extent of her actions, the cold reality of his emptied bank accounts and sold assets, it was far too late. Hannah was gone, leaving him with nothing but the ruin he had created. He was left to pick up the broken pieces of his life, realizing that he had just faced an enemy he hadn't even seen coming. He had underestimated her, and that was going to be his undoing. Hannah wasn't finished. Her revenge wasn't just about emptying Samuel's bank accounts, it was about destroying his entire professional life, his carefully constructed image. She knew that a man like Samuel cared more about his standing in the world than he did about money. So she set out to dismantle everything he had built. She didn't do it out of some grand sense of justice, but out of a cold, calculated need to watch him crumble. Samuel had recently started a new position at a mid-sized financial consulting firm, leveraging his previous professional connections and carefully curated reputation. He believed he could restart his career, leaving behind the whispers and suspicions from his past, but Hannah had other plans. She anonymously sent a package to the company's HR department, a thick envelope containing incriminating evidence of his embezzlement. It was a detailed dossier, meticulously compiled, showing every transaction, every hidden account, every lie he had ever told during his previous employment. The evidence was irrefutable. She included copies of financial documents, timestamps, and details that left no room for doubt. She was precise, she was thorough, and she was relentless. The company launched an immediate and comprehensive internal investigation. Executives were called into closed-door meetings. Whispers echoed through the hallways. And Samuel, once hoping to be the firm's rising star, became the target of intense suspicion. He tried to deny it at first, to spin a web of lies, to deflect blame. He approached the investigation with the same confidence that had worked for him in the past, believing he could talk his way out of anything. But the evidence was too overwhelming. They had all the information he thought he had so carefully hidden. They knew it all. The weight of his past actions was finally crashing down on him. Samuel was summoned to a meeting with the board, his face pale, his hands clammy. He tried to bluff his way through, to offer excuses and deflect blame, but it was futile. The board members looked at him with a mixture of disgust and disappointment. They fired him on the spot, escorting him out of the building like a common criminal. His reputation was shattered, his new career in ruins, his carefully crafted image destroyed in a single afternoon. The news of his firing spread rapidly through professional networks. No one wanted to be associated with him. His phone stopped ringing, and job opportunities evaporated overnight. He was a pariah, radioactive in the professional world. The charming, successful image he had worked so hard to maintain was gone, replaced by the reality of his own deceit. The story of Samuel's downfall became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how quickly a carefully constructed facade can collapse under the weight of past misdeeds. Hannah had achieved her revenge, not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through cold, calculated precision. With Samuel's downfall, Zoe's carefully constructed illusions shattered like glass. The glamorous life she had imagined with him, the freedom, the excitement had all evaporated into a bitter cloud of reality. She saw him for what he was, a fraud, a liar, a man who had used her as a pawn in his twisted game. The charm she had once found so alluring now seemed shallow and desperate. The promises he had whispered now sounded empty and hollow. She realized she had been so caught up in the fantasy that she had ignored the truth that was staring her right in the face. She had traded a stable life with Mason for a life of chaos with Samuel. She felt a pang of regret, a sharp stab of realization that she had made a terrible mistake. She thought of Mason, the stability he had offered, the love she had so carelessly thrown away. She remembered the way he had looked at her the night she had confessed, the pain in his eyes that had mirrored her own. It was a realization that was long overdue, and she felt a wave of shame wash over her. She had acted like a fool, and now she was alone, and it was all her fault. She went back to their old apartment, the place she had so eagerly abandoned, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. She found Mason there, the apartment strangely empty without her presence. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorbell. This wasn't going to be easy. The anger she had seen in his eyes was a warning that she couldn't ignore. When he opened the door, his expression was cold, unreadable. He looked at her like she was a stranger, a ghost from his past that he barely recognized. There was no warmth, no trace of the love she had once known. The hope that had fluttered within her began to falter, like a candle in a strong wind. He was different now. He had changed. "I was fooled by Samuel," she said, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes searching his for a sign of forgiveness. "I made a mistake. Can we try again?" She was pleading, begging for a second chance, for a way back to the life she had so carelessly destroyed. She wanted to pretend that everything could be the way it was before, that she could just turn back the clock and everything would be all right. Mason looked at her, his eyes like chips of ice, his face devoid of any emotion. "The divorce was finalized yesterday," he said, his voice flat without a trace of any emotion. His words were like a punch to her gut. They stole the air from her lungs. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of reconciliation. It was over. The life she had walked away from, the man she had betrayed, it was all gone now, it was all too late. Zoe's face fell, her eyes wide with shock, her mouth slightly agape. She opened her mouth to say something, to plead, to beg, but no words came out. She was speechless, defeated, the reality of her situation crashing down on her like a ton of bricks. She realized with a heavy heart that she had burned all the bridges. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. She turned and left, her shoulders slumped, her steps heavy. Mason watched her go, his expression unwavering. He didn't follow her, didn't call her back. He watched as she walked out of his life, and he never saw her again. The door closed behind her, sealing the finality of their separation. He stood there, in the silence, finally free. Weeks later, Mason was slowly picking up the pieces of his life. The apartment felt different now. Quieter, emptier, but also somehow lighter, free from the constant tension and betrayal that had filled its rooms. He was starting to feel like himself again, like he was finally free from the chaos that had surrounded him. One afternoon, the mail arrived. Among the usual bills and junk, there was a letter, a plain white envelope with an overseas stamp. He recognized the handwriting immediately, a sense of calm settling over him as he opened it. It was from Hannah. Inside, there was a check, made out to him for a substantial sum. Attached to it was a small note, written in neat, precise script. "This is compensation for the trouble Samuel caused," it read. There was no explanation, no long story, just a simple message. It was clear she was done. Mason smiled faintly, a small, almost sad smile that acknowledged the pain in the resolution. He knew Hannah had found her peace, that she had moved on, leaving behind the wreckage of her past. She had taken what was hers and found a new life. He admired her strength, the way she had transformed her pain into action. They had both been victims, but they had both emerged, stronger and more determined. He cashed the check, but he didn't need the money. He looked out the window, thinking about Hannah's calculated revenge. How someone who had seemed so fragile could orchestrate such a precise takedown was both impressive and terrifying. He wondered briefly about Zoe, imagining her probably already searching for her next relationship, her next chance at the life she thought she deserved. But for him, that didn't matter anymore. He was moving forward, finally free.